this video, we will take a look at many examples, finding vertical, horizontal, and slant asymptotes. Example 1, f of x equals 4 over x minus 2 cubed. First, you always want to check to see if you can simplify it. This problem, I cannot simplify it at all. So I generally start with my vertical asymptote. To do that, you take whatever is in the denominator, set it equal to 0. So I would have x minus 2 equals 0, so x equals 2. So my vertical asymptote is x equals 2. Now for the horizontal asymptote, I have to look at the degree of the numerator versus the degree of the denominator. Since the degree of the numerator is 1 and the degree of the denominator is 3, the degree of the denominator is bigger than the degree of the numerator. This implies that my horizontal asymptote is 0. Y equals 0. Now, in this case, we also want to check for slant asymptotes. There is not going to be any because the degree of the numerator, which is 1, is not exactly 1 more than the degree of the denominator. Okay, so slant asymptote, we would write that there are none in this problem. Example 2, f of x equals 1 minus 5x over 1 plus 2x. First, try to simplify it. I can't. So I always find my vertical asymptote first. Set your denominator equal to 0 and solve. So I get that my vertical asymptote is x equals negative 1/2. Then for my horizontal asymptote, I compare the degree of the numerator, which is 1, to the degree of the denominator, which is also 1. So these two are equal. When they're equal, we must set up the ratio of the leading coefficients. So basically, it's the numbers in front of the largest exponent. So in this case, it's going to be y equals negative 5 over 2. That cannot be simplified at all. So my horizontal asymptote is y equals negative 5 over 2. Now again, there is no slant asymptote because the degrees are equal. Okay. The numerator is not exactly 1 more than the degree of the denominator. They're the same, so there is no slant asymptote here. Next example, f of x equals x squared minus 4 over x squared minus 3x plus 2. Check to see if we can simplify, and in this problem we can. So I can factor numerator and denominator. So I get x plus 2 over x minus 1. This is what I now want to use. Okay. So for my vertical asymptote, I set the denominator equal to 0. So I get that x equals 1. For my horizontal asymptote, I compare the degree of the numerator, which is 1, to the degree of the denominator, which is also 1. So these degrees are equal. So again, I must set up the ratio of the leading coefficients. So in this case, it would just be 1/1, or more simply, y equals 1. So my horizontal asymptote would be y equals 1. Now again, there is no slant asymptote here, because again, the degrees are equal. Next example, f of x equals x squared plus 5 over x. Check to see if we can simplify. I cannot. So for my vertical asymptote, I take whatever is in the denominator and I set it equal to 0. My horizontal asymptote, I compare the degree of the numerator, which is 2, to the degree of the denominator, which is 1. Now, since the degree of the numerator is bigger than the degree of the denominator, that means I have no horizontal asymptote. Now this time there is a slant asymptote, because the degree of the numerator, which is 2, is one value larger than the degree of the denominator, which is 1. Now, in order to find my slant asymptote, I need to do some long division. So I do x and x squared plus 0x plus 5. Okay, so x into x squared, I need an x. So when I multiply through, I get x squared. So that gives me 0. So bring down the plus 0x. Well, I can't multiply anything by 0. So then my remainder would just be x plus 5. So my answer, after doing the division, is x plus 5 over x. Okay. Now, in order to find my slant asymptote, it's the part before the remainder. So this value right here. So that means that my slant asymptote is y equals x. And the last problem. F of x equals x squared over x minus 1. First, check to see if I can simplify, which I cannot. So to find my vertical asymptote, I take the denominator, set it equal to 0. So I get x equals 1. Then for my horizontal asymptote, I compare the degree of the numerator, which is 2, to the degree of the denominator, which is 1. Since the degree of the numerator is greater than the degree of the denominator, that means I have no horizontal asymptote. Now, I can have a slant asymptote because the degree of the numerator, which is 2, is exactly one value larger than the degree of the denominator, which is 1. So again, I will do some long division. So I have x minus 1 divided by x squared plus 0x plus 0. So in order to get rid of x into x squared, I need to multiply by an x. So I get x minus 1x, or x squared rather, minus 1x. So I end up with 1x. Bring down my plus 0. So I need to multiply that by a 1. So then I get x minus 1. So then it's 0 minus a negative 1, which gives me a positive 1. So my answer is x plus 1 plus 1 over x minus 1. But remember, I'm only concerned with the part that is not the remainder. So therefore, I know that my slant asymptote is y equals x plus 1. So hopefully these examples have helped clarify the difference between vertical, horizontal, and slant asymptotes and how to find them.